Now, there was one more release this week, again, that we know of. And this is the one that got the most attention. WWE recently hired, for those who don't know, they hired at least 2 female comedy writers. Millie Tamarez is one. She was hired to write for SmackDown. And Kenice Mobley was hired as a writer on the Monday Night Raw brand. Mobley is a stand-up comedian. I had never heard of her before, but apparently she does stand-up comedy. And she was the guest on the Asian Not Asian podcast 2 weeks ago. This was not a podcast that dropped this week. This podcast dropped at least 2 weeks ago, where she talked about being hired by WWE, and she admitted that she knew next to nothing about wrestling. They asked her, were you a wrestling fan before this? No. And being a wrestling fan as a kid, I mean, that's not a prerequisite for the job, but she knew nothing. She knew nothing about wrestling. Now, I listened to it. I didn't just read the transcript. I listened to it. Yes, she is a comedian, and she was in some spots trying to be funny, but not trying to be funny in a way where it came off like she was just making it up. I think she was being honest, but she was just kind of talking in a comedic way. But I want to give a hat tip to Post Wrestling here for the transcription, because I want to read these comments here that got everybody all stirred up. She said, I've just been hired by WWE. Given the things that you know about me and my entire life and what I'm into, yes, that is surprising. They did not require me to know anything about wrestling, but I do have a background in film production and comedy writing, and they're like, perfect, come on in. So I am on the Monday Night Raw team. There's Monday Night Raw and Friday Night SmackDown, and the people I know that are on it are Bobby, his name is either Bobby Ashley or Bobby Lashley, and I really should know that. He's like this giant black guy, and he and the people who are part of his crew, I know that they call, or at least as of last year, they called themselves the Hurt Business. The Hurt Business. They wear suits, and they're like, we're cool. And she went on to say, I went on a date, and this guy was like, don't you feel like he effectively said, don't you feel like you're diminishing your dignity writing for WWE? And I was like, I'm getting paid to do the thing that I've been working on for 8 years. And this is twice, or no, this is 3 times what I make at my nonprofit job. So yeah, I'm going to take it. As you might imagine, these comments caused quite a shitstorm online among fans on social media who were appalled that this woman knew nothing about pro wrestling and that she dared get the name wrong of the current WWE champion on the brand that she now writes for, or did write for. Sean Ross Sapp says that he was told fan reaction to her podcast appearance had little to nothing to do with the decision for WWE to let her go, that it was more of an internal concern. And that might have been what he was told, but I think that's a load of shit. The podcast appearance, as I pointed out, was 2 weeks ago. 24 hours after this suddenly blew up on social media, she was let go. Now, the only other thing I could think of is she was not allowed, perhaps, to make that appearance. They weren't aware of it. The fan reaction made them aware of the fact that she went on this podcast, and maybe they fired her because she wasn't allowed to make an appearance. I would assume, though, if that she was told, you are not allowed to go out and do a podcast appearance, that she wouldn't have done it. So again, I just think it's a load of shit. It's a little too coincidental that right after the fan uproar online, she was fired. Of course it was. Of course it had to do with the fan reaction online. I will bet anything that the fan reaction is what made them aware of the interview in the first place. They probably didn't even know that she was on that podcast. And one of the things that probably did her in, and I don't see too many people talking about this, everybody seems so hung up on her not having any wrestling knowledge. I mean, as if that's her fault. The job didn't require her to have any prior product knowledge. To this company, product knowledge is... I was going to say product knowledge is a plus. It's not a requirement. I'm not so sure that product knowledge is a plus. Because you have stories of other people, even years ago, who would audition for jobs and stuff, and if they picked up on the fact that you were a wrestling fan, it actually worked against you. That's how sick the mindset is among some of the people in this company. But, again, if you ever look at a WWE job posting, I'm not looking at job postings in WWE like I'm interested in applying for one because I don't have a fucking death wish. But they're constantly, this constant turnover on the writing side. And you'll see, like on Twitter, there'll be a job posting that comes up. If you ever really read the job postings, in the majority of cases, if you really kind of read them over, product knowledge is not a requirement. It is not mandatory. It's a plus. Or at least it was. Maybe they'll change that policy now. But I think what really pissed them off and really did her in was the comment that she shared from her friend about being worried, or when she was on a date or whatever it was that she said, about being worried. Are you worried that by working for WWE, you're somehow diminishing your dignity? And she didn't say no. If she would have said no, not at all, and then she, that might have been different, but she didn't disagree. She didn't defend the company at all. She just said, well, it pays more money, so I took the job. The reality is that was a very stupid thing for her to share publicly. And she knew that it was risky even talking about any of this because she jokingly made a comment at the beginning that she hopes that WWE doesn't hear this interview and then revoke her offer. And they kind of laughed it off because, it's a comedy podcast. Ha ha ha. But she acknowledged that she knew she could get in trouble for this. So she was a little too honest for her own good, and it cost her her job. But here's the deal. She said that she was hired to write dialogue for the wrestlers in between their matches. I assume that means, backstage segments, before they went out to the ring and such. I talk all the time on this show about how awful most of the scripted dialogue is on these shows. These people don't even sound human. They sound completely robotic and unnatural and inauthentic. Some people are better at delivering scripted lines than others, right? Some people can take words that other people write for them and they can do okay. A lot of people can't. It's very hard to do that. It's very hard to write for someone else. Like you're using someone else's words. I know actors do it in movies all the time. It's a little bit different. We're not going that deep here. I mean, they say in pro wrestling, the best character is like you're basically being your real self with the volume turned up, right? You're not Heath Ledger playing the fucking Joker. So it's not exactly apples to apples here. It's a hard thing to do. A lot of people can't do it. And I think hiring people who know absolutely nothing, not just about wrestling, but about the product itself or the wrestlers themselves. Look, you can give someone a crash course, but unless you really know these characters inside out and you follow the product closely enough to know about their history and their character traits, it just doesn't work. You're writing stuff for characters that you admittedly know nothing about. She couldn't even get the name of the champion straight. All she knew about him was that he's a big black guy who wears a suit and runs with a group that doesn't even exist anymore. You're doing a disservice to the talent by hiring people who are not qualified for the position. She may have technically met the qualifications that were listed in the job posting, but they're not really qualified for the position. But, as bad as that dialogue is, I have absolutely no problem with them hiring experienced writers for the job who can do a better job than they're doing now. And I also think that having an old guy like Vince McMahon trying to relate to a roster full of millennials, that doesn't work either. Or having writers who can't relate to certain, let's say, ethnic groups, writing for those same ethnic groups. I think diversity on the writing team, be it based on gender or ethnicity, can be a good thing. Because you have a diverse roster. Right? Maybe then we wouldn't end up with the Lucha House Party coming out with a fucking piñata. I don't think all of their new hires need to be able to recite the names of every Royal Rumble winner in history. But they should be required to have a decent amount of product knowledge. The problem is, Not as many people watch the product today as they used to, so you're pulling from a relatively small pool of candidates. But even still, at least be familiar with the brand that you're writing for. I don't blame her for that. I don't blame Kenice Mobley for that. But saying some of the things that she said on that podcast, she knew that she might get fired for it. She said it anyway, and that's exactly what happened. I'm all for getting fresh faces in there who can write good television and write better dialogue. I know those people are out there. I know they are. They have to be. Those people are out there. They exist. You just got to find them. You know, Meltzer in The Observer this week, and this was before they fired her. The Observer dropped on the same day, hours before the firings. But he posted in The Observer, he said that she had a lot of heat on her internally for talking publicly about things that WWE does not like being talked about. And that the company was, according to one person, embarrassed. And that they felt it made them look blindingly stupid. That was the quote that he had in The Observer. They felt they looked blindingly stupid to the outside world. A lot of the stuff they do makes them look blindingly stupid to the inside wrestling world, let alone the outside world. But apparently that's how they felt. Well, I got news for you. If you hire someone to work for you, and that person then openly talks about your hiring practices in public, and you think that makes you look blindingly stupid, maybe the problem isn't the person that you just hired. Maybe the problem lies in your fucking hiring practices. That's the main reason that she was fired. She was fired because the company was embarrassed. She embarrassed them. And they have nobody to blame but themselves for being embarrassed. They don't want to hire wrestling people. You ask yourself, why would they bring in people who aren't required to have wrestling knowledge or product knowledge? They don't want to hire wrestling people because they don't see themselves as a wrestling company. They're ashamed of it. You could feel the disdain. You can hear the disdain in Vince McMahon's voice on that Stone Cold podcast years ago that he did whenever Austin would call it pro wrestling. He hates it. He loathes being called pro wrestling. But that's what it is. And that's what it'll always be. Nobody is ever, never, ever going to say, hey, let's go to the sports entertainment matches tonight. Nobody is ever going to say that. It is fucking wrestling. So I am not surprised that it is not a requirement for the job. I think both parties were in the wrong here. Some of the comments she made were just asking for trouble. Some of the comments she made were blindingly stupid. She may be a comedian, but companies don't often have a sense of humor about these things. You and I may have a sense of humor. She may have a sense of humor. Big corporations, they don't have a sense of humor. Nick Khan does not have a sense of humor. Or he has a very grim sense of humor. There may be examples of people who they hire, who they bring in, who don't have hardly any product knowledge, and maybe it does work out. Look at Jimmy Smith. On Raw, he's been doing a pretty good job so far. Much better than Adnan Virk as the lead play-by-play guy on Monday Night Raw. And if you remember, when his name was first announced as the new play-by-play commentator, there was an old tweet from a few years ago that was dug up where he admitted that he hadn't watched wrestling since he was a kid. He wasn't familiar with it. He was an MMA guy. But so far, it's working out. He's putting the work in, right? He hasn't embarrassed himself on television. I'm not saying that it can't work. You can't ever bring anybody from the outside who has little to no product knowledge and they're never going to succeed. I would like, for at least a basic amount of product knowledge to be required of, people who are going to work in this company. But I do think that there is a need for more people who can write better dialogue, whether or not, they have super wrestling knowledge or not. It's a big problem on a lot of these shows. We need people who can write better dialogue, who are experienced writers, because the dialogue on a lot of these shows sucks. I'm sure Bobby Ashley would agree.